Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a developer by developing yourself, your skills, your network, your habits, and more. I'm one of your co-hosts, Peter Elbaum, and today we're talking about something that falls more in the mindset bucket. So I had an episode that was a couple weeks ago where I also talked about a mindset thing. And as you know, on this podcast, we talk about habits, strategies, building your network, building yourself, developing yourself. And so this is just another aspect of developing yourself. Specifically, it has to do with two mindsets that you can take when learning to code. And these aren't exhaustive. They're not the only mindsets that you could possibly have, but they're two that I see fairly commonly, and they're a bit at odds. That's not to say that you have to pick one or the other, but they're on basically two ends of a spectrum, right? And so depending on which one that you gravitate towards, it's going to influence how you spend your time, how you feel about coding, the strategies that you take to learn how to code. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about them today, get into what they are and the characteristics of each, so that you can begin to reflect a little bit on which one you lean more towards and begin to think a little bit about how that's going to influence the strategies that you use to learn to code, if you're planning to learn to code or if you're learning. And it may shift how you're approaching your career if, for example, you're already into your first or second job. And so let's go ahead and get into it. I will not bury the lead any further. What exactly are we talking about? We're talking about two different mindsets. Like I said, the first one I call the craftsman mindset, and the second one I call the pragmatist mindset. So basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get into each of those, the qualities of each, and also some examples I've had just from people that I've worked with, what their lives have looked like given that they're following one or the other, and also how I think that would affect your learning if you are learning to code or planning to learn to code. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so let's start with the craftsman mindset. This is a person who basically approaches coding as a craft, as you might guess from the name. This person is a craftsperson. This person is basically doing coding because they love it in and of itself. So they may be doing it for work, but at the end of the day, they are doing it, as we say, for the love of the game, right? They're driven by kind of this intrinsic motivation of just loving coding, loving the act of coding, loving thinking through things, loving checking out new technologies, loving digging into how things work. And so for them, like I said, coding is an end in and of itself. There's no place we're really trying to go with it except for just doing more of it. And so this reminds me of this concept of infinite games versus finite games. For the craftsman, coding is an infinite game. In an infinite game, the whole goal is just to do more of that thing. And so because coding is an end in itself, for the craftsperson, they just want to do more code. They want to write more code. They want to learn more. They want to learn more technologies. And that's really it. And so what does this person's life look like? I'll tell you a little bit of an example from a colleague I had. This person was definitely a craftsperson. No surprise, this person was an unbelievable engineer, and in 3 or 4 years had accomplished and had a level of knowledge that people 7 or 8 years into their career don't have, just because in his free time, he was checking out new technologies, he was reading blogs, he was digging into new technologies, building little projects with them just to try out new technologies, was always up on the latest developments in React or Redux or state management or JavaScript tooling or other stuff. He had gone to a boot camp where there was only front end offered, actually the same boot camp I went to. At that point, it didn't have a full stack curriculum. It was only front end. And he had befriended his teacher, gotten the teacher to teach him back end, and had basically since then taken it and run with it, and had taught himself microservice architecture, had taught himself GraphQL. This guy was an animal at the end of the day. And the thing about him was it wasn't like his motivation was coming from something extrinsic, or at least that was kind of my impression. You meet these people, right? They're very high achieving, but it's an external pressure that's driving them, whether it's what do people think, or I'm afraid I might lose my job, so I really need to bear down and get these skills so that I'm not the one that gets fired. This guy was not like that at all. He had the love of the game. He loved it. And so because of that, he was just driven inherently, internally to do these things. And so because of that, because he was spending his free time building little projects, because he just loved it, he got really good in a short amount of time. And so this is just one example. By the way, this person was an absolute joy to work with. If he's listening, you know who you are. Thank you. Learned a lot from him and was really inspired by him. And so what does this person look like? What do their days look like? What I just talked about could be one example, but there are other people that do open source. So open source is kind of like a second job, honestly, for the people who are really into it, the people who maintain the packages that we all use every day. It's a lot of work. And so the people that maintain those, that write the code for those packages, are craftsmen, I would say. I feel like it would be hard to do all of that work otherwise. And of course, I should stop now and say these things exist on a spectrum, and there's more mindsets than just these two with which to approach coding in your career. So I'm painting in broad brushstrokes, but just for the purposes of this podcast and kind of having a conversation around these things, that's why I'm doing that. So with that said, I'm imagining that most people who do open source are craftsmen, craftspeople, and they're approaching these things, spending so much time on these projects that most of them don't get paid for because they love it. They're driven intrinsically. What else? A person that checks out new technology. So I just mentioned my colleague who had this habit, was always digging into new stuff, right? Whenever there was something new released. This is a person who told me about Immer, which is the basis for Redux Toolkit, one of the main libraries. This was, 3 years ago. But this person was early to the game. So I think in general, craftspeople are into new tech. And as I mentioned as well, they spend a lot of their free time coding, whether that's open source, their own projects, or whatever it may be. And so that's kind of an image, at least it's my image, of what the craftsman looks like. And so if you're this person, I think your learning is going to be easier in some ways, harder in others, as opposed to people who maybe aren't driven intrinsically as much. So I think this kind of person, if you have already discovered you're a craftsperson and you're approaching a coding boot camp, then you need to focus yourself, basically, because I think the danger is that you're super driven intrinsically, and so you don't have to force yourself to do anything, but potentially your energy is all over the place because you see all this new technology to learn. Maybe you get a little bit distracted. This is pretty common among a lot of engineers. It's called shiny object syndrome, where you get distracted by every piece of new technology. You get maybe a little bit in the weeds and lose the bigger picture. So if this is you, I would say ride that motivation wave that's coming from inside yourself, but make sure to focus, put some structure around yourself to help yourself focus and get stuff done, and to learn the things that are in the curriculum, which may not always be the things that you wish you were learning, but are necessary to get through your coding bootcamp or whatever kind of program you're in. Okay, so we talked about the craftsman. Let's move on to the pragmatist. So I'll start with just the general characteristics. So with the craftsman, we talked about coding as a craft for the craftsman. For the pragmatist, coding is more of a skill. We're thinking about it more as a skill that we acquire. For a craftsman, they are driven largely by the love of the game. For a pragmatist, there's usually some kind of goal, or we would say maybe means to an end, which sounds negative, but I don't think is actually that negative. So for the pragmatist, it may just be, hey, I need a job in a growing sector, and so I've decided to become a developer because tech is in demand. Or it may be, hey, I love what I do, but I'm not making enough money. Let's think of like a teacher, for example. Teachers very underpaid in America. And so it may just be, hey, I need to make more money. I'm going to acquire this skill in order to get a job that pays better. By the way, these are perfectly valid. I think potentially the way that co-host Aaron and I can talk about these things, we may sound a little bit more biased towards craftsmen because that craftsman quality of discovery, intrinsic motivation tends to bode really well for coding bootcamp students. But I want to be really clear right now, we're not favoring one or the other. In fact, we're both kind of more in the pragmatist bucket at this point. I'll talk a little bit about that. But I don't think there's anything wrong, is my point, with coding, seeing it, acquiring the skills as a means to an end. Means to end sounds negative, but we could just say with a goal in mind, goal driven. I think that's totally fine. So the pragmatist sees coding as a tool in the tool belt, just one more tool in the tool belt. This is how I've grown to see it over time. At first, I used to be kind of more craftsman, where it was like coding is my identity. I am an engineer. That is what I do. Now more, I see it as it's one skill I have. It's an extremely useful and powerful skill, but it's one way to approach solving a problem, and I'm glad I have it. But as I said, one tool in the tool belt. That is how the pragmatist sees it. The pragmatist may not spend all their free time on projects or open source or checking out new technology. So the pragmatist, they may approach this saying, hey, I want a job in a growing industry that pays well. And then when I'm done with that job, I want to pursue my hobbies. And those hobbies may have nothing to do with writing code. And that's totally fine. The pragmatist may be a little bit more balanced. And as I said, none is better than the other. Craftsman is not better than pragmatist or vice versa. It's just a different goal and a different mindset with which you're approaching acquiring these skills. So one example, I think there's a few examples I mentioned. Aaron and I think are both kind of more pragmatists at this point. I'll just talk about myself as an example. So I started out, as I mentioned, kind of more in the craftsman bucket, with code as more my identity. Like I acquired these skills and I was just full bore on coding for this first few years. I was going to hackathons, I was going to conferences, I was trying to speak at meetups, I was trying to make my first few open source contributions. And part of that is that I was trying to grow my career, right? At the beginning, when you don't have any experience, it's helpful to have other stuff to point to kind of establish your credibility. But over time, I think a few things happened that kind of moved me more towards the pragmatist side. Part of it is just that I have the intrinsic motivation, I think, but I don't necessarily want to spend all my time checking out new technology and building projects unless they're businesses. I'm passionate about building businesses, but not necessarily side projects for side projects' sake. And I also, as I mentioned, I've evolved a little bit to see coding as one tool in the tool belt and not everything I did. I think meeting co-host Aaron and working with him has also gone a long way towards that, just because Aaron, if you don't know, is very skilled at a lot of different things. And so he can do marketing, he can do sales, he can do coding, he can do automations, he can do operations and process. A lot of that, I think, comes from running your own business. But meeting with Aaron, listening to podcasts like Indie Hackers that we have mentioned a lot, and just getting more exposure to people that run their own businesses who are also technical has caused me over time to see, hey, this is a really powerful thing. This is a great thing. This enables you to do a lot of incredible work, to build products, to automate things, but you can understand it as one tool in the tool belt. It doesn't have to be your everything. And so that's kind of me. If you are a student and you're thinking about going to a boot camp, or you're maybe even in your career, or you're starting to kind of change your mindset, I think kind of the challenge here, I'll just talk about maybe beginning coding bootcamp students. If you're saying, hey, I'm doing this, yeah, I'm interested in it, but I'm not going to spend all my free time doing it. I want to get a job. I want to make pretty good money. For that person, I would say you will probably struggle a little bit more with loving the process. So Aaron and I have been hammering this idea this fall of process over results. The challenge for a pragmatist being goal-oriented is that what is a goal orientation? It's kind of a results orientation. And so I think the challenge for me, honestly, when I was in coding bootcamp, I went because I wanted a better paying job. And so when the code would break and when things wouldn't work, it felt like, oh, it's just taking me longer to get where I want to go. And so if you're a little bit more on this pragmatist side, I think the struggle is going to be in learning all that you need to learn during the process in order to get to where you need to go. So if you need to reflect a little bit more on how to embrace the process, we've done a few podcasts in the past few weeks that I think are get into this idea a little bit more. So if you basically listen to anything from kind of end of July to now, it's end of October, we'll talk about this a lot. We've been talking about it a lot lately, but it's just something to keep in mind that if you're in this bucket, this will likely be a little bit more of a struggle for you. It's not to say that it can't be overcome. I overcame it. I know other people that have overcome it, and the curiosity grows and gets better with time as you get better, I think, for people that are a little bit like us, but just something to keep in mind. A few closing ideas here, just a few things to keep in mind. So there's no one way to approach learning to code. These are two different ideas. As I mentioned, I'm painting a little bit with broad brushstrokes here. There are other things I'm sure I haven't thought of, but I thought these were just convenient archetypes, I guess, to stimulate conversation. There's a lot of different ways to learn to code. One is not better than the other. So wherever you fall, that's totally fine. Which brings me to my next point, which is that I think each can learn from the other. I think craftsmen have stuff to learn from pragmatists. Maybe the pragmatists help the craftsmen kind of see the bigger picture a little bit. I think craftsmen can get lost in the weeds and sometimes want to use new tech for new tech's sake instead of being a little bit more practical about what the problem is that we're solving. And for pragmatists, I think they can learn from craftsmen, as I just mentioned, love of the game, love of the process of learning, and seeing how powerful it is when you are absorbing and kind of emphasizing your curiosity and allowing it to drive you, how powerful that is, how much learning happens on the other side of being curious. I think that is what pragmatists can learn from craftsmen. As I mentioned, you can change. So I went from a little bit more craftsman oriented. Well, I should say, I guess I kind of was a pragmatist in coding boot camp. Then I kind of moved a little bit more towards the craftsman end of the spectrum during the first 2 years of my career, and then kind of went back to the pragmatist direction. So basically, it's possible to kind of fluctuate along these in my mind. And like I mentioned, they're totally made up constructs anyway. So assuming these are real things, I think you can kind of be at one end of the spectrum and move along the spectrum. So it's not like this is a fixed attribute necessarily. I can see these things changing for people depending on where you are in life, what your priorities are, how much time you have, whether or not maybe you just had a kid or whatever. Talked a little bit about this with our episode with Jake Dome back earlier this year. So that might be an interesting reference point if you're interested in hearing two people talk about that. But in any case, that's more or less what I've got for us today. I hope this was helpful to you in some way and causes you to reflect a little bit on just what your motivations are and what your inclinations are as you're approaching possibly going to a boot camp or how to approach your tech career if you're already in one. So that's all for today. Thanks so much for listening. A few shameless plugs. Parsity is at parsity.io. My YouTube channel is at youtube.com/PeterLbaum. And we've also got a free cohort-based JavaScript course that's called Dev30. That's at dev30.xyz. And I came out with a Udemy course this year called Junior to Senior that packages up everything I learned about getting promotions as a software engineer. So links to all those things are in the show notes, and feel free to reach out to us if we can be helpful. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you in the next one.